Hello, and welcome to The Briefing, a weekly conversation with leaders and experts to explore the ideas and issues shaping our democracy today. I'm Michael Waldman. I'm the president of the Brennan Center for Justice. It's hard to believe, but it's going to be only a little more than a year from now that we will have the crucial midterm election. It's really incumbent on all of us to make sure that this election is free and fair and secure, and certainly that is what we at the Brennan Center are going to be doing. But there's a new factor in all of this right now. The new role, what we believe is a dangerous role, for the federal government. And that's what we're here to talk about today. I'm joined by two of the top experts at the Brennan Center on our elections and on voting and voting rights. Sean Morales-Doyle is the director of our Voting Rights and Elections program. And Jasleen Singh is an attorney at the Brennan Center, the author of an important study that we're going to be talking about, and one of our leading voting rights lawyers. And we are glad to be here with both of you. This is, of course, a big issue. Voting is always really important.
Sure.
When you look at the history of the country, there's always been a lot of fighting about voting. There's always been a lot of tussle and people trying to get more ability to participate and other people pushing back. How has it really gone in the last few elections? There was so much pressure from the pandemic, from all the lies and threats of violence. How did the system work and how did it not work in your view?
It's a great question. I think it's absolutely true that this fight over who has access and over voting is in many ways sort of the fight that defines the history of our country, and we've had a lot of ups and downs. The last few elections have, even in that larger context, been fairly unprecedented in a number of ways, and our democracy, I think, has faced attacks and challenges that it's never faced before. That includes a pandemic, that includes a sitting president attempting to overturn the outcome of an election. It includes a growing election denier movement that came after that attempt, and really a decade plus of states acting to try to restrict access to voting in many parts of the country. I think what we've learned from those elections is, number one, our democracy is strong and is resilient. Despite all of that, we still had safe and secure elections, some of our safest and most secure in 2020, 2022, and 2024. We still had record participation in 2020, a little bit less so in 2024. And we saw our election officials and our infrastructure standing up in the face of many of those challenges. That doesn't mean everything was perfect. We don't have a perfect democracy. We have a flawed democracy. Much of the work we do here at the Brennan Center is to try to get us to the democracy we deserve. We were still dealing with votes being suppressed and maps being gerrymandered and all of the things that people who follow the Brennan Center will know about. So we still have work to do, but I have been struck by how much, in the face of all those pressures, our system has held. Voters have participated. They have invested in this democracy to try to get it to where it could be. And in some instances, they've shown up for democracy itself. I think in the last couple of elections, we've heard voters saying that's an issue that matters to them. In 2022, we saw in many places voters splitting their partisan alliances in order to vote against election officials who were election deniers. I think voters have impressed me and the way they've continued to stand behind our democracy in the face of all these challenges.
And there have been flashes of moments where sort of the state of voting became an issue, not a partisan issue, but a civic issue. In 2020, when so many poll workers who were elderly couldn't show up because of the health threat, major businesses recruited 600,000 people to be poll workers and Absolutely. That kind of thing. And, of course, that's a challenge to get that kind of civic spirit, not just in a crisis year like that. I always tell the story of how at the very beginning of the country, the big issue was whether there needed to be a property requirement for men to vote. And Ben Franklin in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania wrote their constitution and eliminated the property requirement for all men of all races, not for women. And people suggested to John Adams, who was writing the Massachusetts Constitution, that he should do the same thing. And he was aghast. And he said, if we do that, women will demand the right to vote. Lads of
How awful would that be?
Lads of 18 will demand the right to vote, and men who hath not a farthing to their name will think themselves worthy of an equal voice in government, and they will demand the right to vote. And John Adams said, there will be no end of it. And that's basically the history of the country, because the expansion of that franchise which took a lot of effort and struggle and always had this pushback, actually is one of the great stories of American democracy. The question, as you've looked at this, is what is really different this year? What lifts it out of this kind of narrative of the history of the country?
Right. So I think this year, for the first time and in sort of an unprecedented way, we're seeing what you said at the top of this session is the federal government is attempting to interfere with our elections in big ways, in small ways, in technical ways, in messaging ways. And we're seeing this strategy play out in election security, an attempt to rewrite our election rules, supporting people who have a history of denying the election or otherwise interfering with the election. We have the DOJ sort of turning the ship around in terms of walking away from voting rights, walking away from protecting voters, to actually aggressively sort of looking for supposed voter fraud, creating task forces to do that. And so we are seeing this at various levels of the government in various ways, and it's really unprecedented.
That's the critical point. This is not the role the federal government has typically played. To the extent it's been involved at all, it's generally been to try to get the states to actually do better on voting. But it's a big charge. We can back this up.
Yes, we can back
And that's what we're going to do in this conversation. But it's important that we recognize this is a really significant thing that is happening, and what we are going to try to do is connect the dots and kind of, some of this is stuff that's very well known and others are technical and arcane things. When I started working on this stuff here, I came to the Brennan Center more focused in my own interests on democracy around issues of money and politics and things like that, campaign finance. And it seems impossible to believe, but this was not that big an issue. For most of the time, voting was something technical. It was a bit arcane. The kind of political insiders really knew all about it. But I think it's a bit of retrofitting history for people to say, oh, this fight has been going on like this for decades and decades. I think it really started up after the Florida recount in 2000, when people kind of realized, oh, you could really win an election. This is a ramshackle system. You could win an election by suppressing the vote, or you could win an election by turbocharging turnout. And suddenly the stakes, got a lot higher. But early on, when we would tell people, there's people trying to make it harder for other people to vote, basically, people weren't sure they believed it. It seemed very implausible. That, at least, we don't have to worry about surmounting that barrier anymore, for better or worse. Let's talk about what we think is happening right now. What are the new things? What are these things that the executive branch is doing that people should understand? And as we said, some of it is stuff maybe they've heard about, and some of it is stuff that they haven't. And of course, it's really hard to keep track of everything because it's like 12 outrages a day and things that we might think are, well, about this executive order or that, and that was like the third one that day. But one of the main things is, in fact, an executive order in March that was purporting basically by the president to take personal control of the election system in the United States. And I think it's really important, even as we talk about it, a lot of these executive orders, they're kind of like malevolent press releases. They really don't have the force of law, because if you don't have the power legally to do the thing, then it may sound like you're announcing some big action, but it isn't necessarily the case. Where does others, of course, are really forceful. Where does this fit in, and what was that executive order?
So this executive order that came out in March was a blatant attempt to rewrite election rules, and where that fits on the scale is, quite frankly, the president does not have the authority to rewrite election rules. The power to set election rules is with Congress and with the states.
And why is that?
That's in our Constitution.
It is in the Constitution, but I think there's a good reason it's in the Constitution, which is maybe it's obvious to people if you just say it a little bit differently. Like, does it make sense to have one partisan official, the president of the United States, be in charge of how elections are run? Obviously folks in Congress are partisan and people in state legislatures are partisan too, but they're part of these bodies that debate and come up with rules, and they're subject to, the other side pushing back. And to have just one man And in this case, maybe it's particularly concerning, a man who has tried to overturn the outcome of an election in the recent history. But to have just one man who has partisan interests at heart control how our elections are run is not a good idea. And I think that's why the Elections Clause does, as Jasleen said, give the power to Congress and the states.
And it's interesting because the framers were very concerned about abuse of power, of the potential of a president to be, as they saw it, a king, a Cromwell, something like that. And they were very focused. If you read the notes from James Madison at the Constitutional Convention, the part of the Constitution that deals with a lot of this stuff is called the Elections Clause. And it's really specifically designed, they didn't use these words, to block voter suppression and gerrymandering. They didn't call it gerrymandering because Elbridge Gerry was standing right there, and they hadn't made up the word yet. But that was literally what they were debating, and so it's not a surprise that these issues are touched on by this. So the president says, I'm doing this, and he actually doesn't have the power to do it. But what is it that the executive order purported to do?
Right. So the executive order purports to, the president purports to direct a commission called the Election Assistance Commission. It's an independent bipartisan agency of the federal government. It purports to direct that commission to add a documentary proof of citizenship requirement to the federal voter registration form. So it would, if it had come to fruition, it would have required the EAC, the commission, to basically require a passport or similar citizenship document whenever you're using the federal voter registration form, which is basically, a federal postcard. You have a question?
I can't wait. No, go ahead.
Many voters use this to register to vote, and it would be absolutely burdensome, and it could potentially disenfranchise millions of people because our research has shown before that at least 21 million people in America don't have ready access to a citizenship document, a passport, a birth certificate, naturalization document. And so if this had come to fruition, it would stand to disenfranchise millions of people. So that's one part of the EO. And
a lot of this came up because there's a piece of legislation in Congress, a really bad piece of legislation called the SAVE Act, that would basically require people to produce a passport or a birth certificate or naturalization papers, but basically for most people a passport or birth certificate to register and to vote in the United States. And not only do 21 million people not have access to that, that doesn't even count all the people whose names are different on their birth certificate than their married name, which is millions of married women. But we think, tell me if I'm wrong, we think that the executive order doesn't even really let you use the birth certificate, that you have to use a passport.
It's a passport or other document,
And half, as I understand it, half of all Americans don't have a passport. Which, how do they summer in the south of France if they don't have a passport? Yet that is the case. So this is the big thing that President Trump is trying to do with this thing. We don't sue that often. We don't actually go to court that often. But this time we did.
We did.
And what happened?
And we won in court, and we have a preliminary injunction in place at the moment. And the judge found that this provision the president does not have the power or the authority to direct the EAC in this manner.
Am I right? They didn't even appeal it, or was that old news?
They did not appeal the preliminary injunction. As Jasleen said, for the moment, it is a preliminary injunction, which means we're still fighting to get a final ruling on this. But the government did not appeal that preliminary victory, and so we're hoping, in the coming months to make it final, and then we'll see whether they appeal that. But we're winning for the time being.
So one of the things is this executive order, and it was kind of lost in the shuffle of all the craziness that was going on, but that was a pretty important thing.
Yeah.
At one point in the last few weeks, President Trump put out a social media post saying, I'm going to do another executive order, and this time I'm going to personally ban vote by mail, which is how 1 in 3, I believe, Americans actually cast their ballots.
That's right.
It seems somebody told them, you can't do that, and they kind of backed off.
Or maybe that would be a really bad idea.
Well, I think that, if you remember in the last election, the Republican Party actually mounted, as it always had before, a robust, absentee ballot operation. It was never like a partisan thing until recent years.
Yeah, about 1 in 4 Republicans cast their ballot by mail in the 2024 election also. So, yeah, maybe someone told him it was a bad idea, or maybe he, had second thoughts. I'm not sure. But I do think that post about the potential forthcoming executive order, confirmed so much of what we've been saying about this campaign, that it is a concerted campaign, that this is a strategy for the federal government to take over our elections. We had been saying that and have been saying that because, as you say, as Jasleen said very well, we've seen all these big and small things that have been happening, right? We realize that not everybody follows, what the president's doing with regard to election security officials and who's getting fired and all of that the way that we do. And people are hearing about so many things happening, about executive orders on shower pressure and, just
he's
weird
right,
things.
He's right on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I like
unambiguously, I would say.
But it's hard to see the forest for the trees. It's hard to notice how all these things fit together. But we have been saying, look, it's a concerted strategy. There's all these different tactics, and you can see how they fit together. But then he puts this True Social post up, and he says, yes, I'm going to ban mail voting. I'm going to ban voting machines. But what he also said, which I think is maybe more significant than the insane policies he's proposing, is the states are just agents of the federal government when it comes to elections. And by the federal government, I mean me, the president of the United States of America.
And he used that word, agents.
Yes,
this
those
is
are
not a paraphrase.
almost, this is not quite a perfect quote, but those were his words. And so he just told us all, he just confirmed this is a campaign by the president of the United States to say, I'm the one who runs elections and everybody else just has to do what I say, which is emphatically not the case under our Constitution.
In other words, this is a real concerted strategy. It's not just for the clicks and the outrage of the hour. So we've got this executive order. One of the other things we identified, as you mentioned, is, and this didn't get a ton of attention, the firing, the purging of pretty much the entire election security operation of the federal government, which had been really helpful to state and local officials of both parties in the past, dealing with both cybersecurity and physical security threats. And he even threatened, or actually asked for an investigation of a guy named Chris Krebs, who had been the top election security person in 2020, who had the temerity to say, yeah, actually the election was quite secure.
Yeah. And who'd been appointed by the president in this
by the president.
Yeah.
And one of the hopes, and voting rights groups across the spectrum are working to ensure that actually some of these experts and scientists and others can continue to help outside the federal government to make sure that the elections are free and fair or secure at the very least. So we've got the executive order, we've got the purging of the election security apparatus, which again certainly wasn't, the top of the news. What about the requests, the demands for data? What's so terrible about that? I mean, people kind of can't quite believe that one of the things they did was they ordered the states to turn over the voter rolls with a lot of sensitive private information to DOJ. Because what could go wrong, right, with that? But it's not just that; it's much more than that. So why is that something to worry about? And why do we count that as part of this strategy?
Again, here's where I would use the words of the people doing it rather than taking my word for it. The head of the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice has said herself that her goal here as the head of the Civil Rights Division is not to slow the train down. She said that in previous Republican administrations, the goal has been to slow the train down. I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's what she said. And she said, that's not my goal. My goal is to turn the train around and drive it in the opposite direction. Harmeet Dillon. And she basically said what the Civil Rights Division has done in the past is diametrically opposed to what I am trying to do now. We are trying to do the opposite of what the Civil Rights Division has done in the past. That's why people should be worried. The Civil Rights Division, since its founding, it was created in order to enforce our civil rights laws, including the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And it has been one of the best, actors in this space. It has been there to defend those protections and to enforce those protections for over 60 years. To turn it on its head and say now we're going to be doing the opposite should worry people. At the same time, the Civil Rights Division, including and in fact the lawyers in the criminal parts of the Department of Justice have been sending these requests to election officials, asking them without any real justification or explanation to hand over all kinds of personal and private information about all voters.
We think about 27 states, right, have gotten these
At least
requests?
27 states, but there's been some statements already from the department that have been reported from election officials that they're going to do this in all 50 states. They're going to be asking for this kind of information in all 50 states. And first of all, the reason they're asking for it, also, again, in the words of the administration, in that executive order, President Trump asked them to do this in order to, what he says, identify unqualified voters on the rolls, essentially saying that the federal government should be playing the role of state election officials in cleaning the rolls, making sure, doing what we call voter list maintenance, making sure rolls are accurate and up to date, which is, again, not at all the role of the federal government. That's what election officials do. They take that job seriously, and they take the privacy and security of their voters' information seriously, which is why you've seen so many of these election officials of both major parties saying no to these requests.
And one of the kind of things we've all learned in the last few years is the role that these election officials play, and they really aren't partisan. The further away you get from the center of the political fight, these are not glamour jobs. They're and they didn't bargain for being in the middle of this storm of abuse and partisanship and everything like that. And they've really stepped up. And we've had the chance to work with a lot of them. But I will confess I didn't think very much about all of that until the last few years.
Right. I think a colleague here at the Brennan Center told me the other day that the average age or demographic of an election official is a woman over 60 or something like that. And so if you think about that, you think like those folks are really just trying to run a free and fair election. That is their role. That is their job. And I think the environment in which we find ourselves is making that job harder.
Well, that goes to one of the other things that we've seen unfolding, and it hasn't really happened fully yet, but they're certainly telegraphing it, which is basically using investigations to kind of intimidate or potentially intimidate the rest of the election system. I mentioned the Chris Krebs thing. There are now 2 task forces, right, in the Justice Department? 3. Oh, now I'm scared. Then I'm changing my stance. If there were only 2. And these are not looking for violations of voting rights. These seem to be looking for ways to put pressure on state and local officials to do what?
I mean, I think they can be used in that way to put pressure to threaten election officials in that way. I think they can be used in that way. And I think the fear that we have is I look back on the 2020 election and I look back at people like Brad Raffensperger, who was given a call by Trump to try to find votes, and he refused. Raffensperger refused at that point. We had officials who said, no, we're not going to mess with the results of an election. And now with the threat of prosecution from these 3 task forces and other folks in the administration who have said, we're going to go after election officials, I think also not a direct quote, but something to the effect of the folks who ran the 2020 election should go to jail. And so when we have things like that happening, election officials who are already sort of in a threat environment are poised to be targeted even more, but this time by the federal government.
One of the questions I always have with all of this is so much of this toward what end? In other words, what is the purpose of this concerted effort? Is it to change the results? We don't know that. But is it to kind of just minimize public trust? A lot of this comes around to the kind of rumors and scare stories about what's going on in our elections. As we've said, the elections have a lot of problems, but one thing is they've been quite secure. Yeah. And yet there's this effort to push people to believe there's so much non-citizen voting. And I want to kind of draw people's attention to something that rather delicious that happened the other day, which is, it is really vanishingly rare that non-citizens will vote in this country. Only citizens vote. States have a multiplicity of systems in place to make sure that only citizens vote. But nevertheless, this is the argument that's out there. It's the rumor that's being pushed. The Secretary of State of Louisiana, who's a Republican, did a big study, and she announced it, flanked by all these sober-suited men, including the chairman of the Louisiana Doge. And she announced that we've done this study, and we found, I believe, 79 people who we think might be non-citizens who voted in the last 40 years in the state.
Yes, since the 80s.
Since the 80s.
Since I've been alive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we counted up that there were 74 million votes cast in Louisiana during that time.
Yeah, actually a lot more than 74 million. We did a conservative estimate based on the data we had available to us, but it's actually significantly more than 74 million votes cast in Louisiana in that time. So it's 1 in a million, which matches up with everything we've always said, and anyone who's ever studied this has ever said about how infinitesimally rare it is that you see voter fraud of any kind, including, a non-citizen voting. And in fact, in the very rare instances when a non-citizen does vote in this country, it usually turns out to be because of a misunderstanding or because they were misled about their eligibility.
And she said very earnestly and deadpan, non-citizen voting is not a systemic problem here in Louisiana. And we, of course, silently said yes, or anywhere else. And of course, one of the elements of this is that the Speaker of the House is Mike Johnson from Louisiana, who's pushing the SAVE Act.
Yeah.
And even he almost couldn't quite keep it together when he was arguing for it. He said, well, there's no evidence for this, but intuitively we know it must be true.
That's on vibes.
And we have some vibes. And so now she has unvibed the vibes.
Well, and next to her, one of the people standing with this press conference was actually a state legislator who has been one of the people pushing for Louisiana to pass its own. Louisiana actually last year passed its own sort of version of the SAVE Act to require people to show one of these documents. And when they had made this announcement about how infinitesimally rare this phenomenon was, he was quoted saying something like, yeah, I'm actually surprised at how rarely this happens. I do think some of the folks pushing these lies have grown to believe them, and they're kind of surprised when they find out, oh, actually, it's not true.
That's nice.
Yeah.
So again, what we think is this is not just kind of random stuff. This is a concerted strategy. It's going to continue between now and Election Day. And it's going to be necessary for people who care about the security and stability of the election to continue to push back. One of the questions I was going to ask, and we're now going to turn to some of the questions from our audience, all of you, cool. who are writing questions in the chat. And this was actually the question I was going to ask. The one thing we didn't talk about is the role of this increased use domestically of the military and how this could play into all of this stuff. To me, one of the scariest things that we've had over this very intense summer, a summer of tragedy, a summer with a terrible assassination, but even before that with a lot of tension and political conflict mounting, was when the California Democrats had an event to announce they were going to do a ballot initiative on redistricting. I believe it was ICE or CBP in masks, fully armed, showed up outside the event and said, oh, is this a coincidence? But it seemed, from the outside at least, like it may have been a bit more than a coincidence. How could the use of the military play into this kind of stuff as an election approaches? And I don't want you to be too dystopian, but what should people be worried about and what should they not be worried about?
So I think we're differently situated this year compared to for 2020 when this was sort of in the ethers, but definitely it's not going to happen. I think the position we're in this year is different. One, because of the example you just gave. Also, we've seen the National Guard be deployed in Los Angeles. And so they're there in the community right now without the governor's consent. And so we're in a different position now. I think that, I don't want to scare people, but I do think we have to sort of give credence to the possibility that there may be federal agents in and around elections. And a number of elections are happening this year in November, California, New York, and a few other places. New Jersey. And so it is a possibility. However, the good, having the military, having federal agents at election places is illegal. Armed federal agents at election places is illegal. Federal agents interfering with our elections is illegal. And so we do have strong laws on this point.
Who says it's illegal? No, in what way is it illegal?
We have the statute.
It's a federal crime.
It's a federal crime.
Yeah, it is.
I'm learning new things.
Yeah, people want to go look it up. It's 18 U.S.C. sections 592 and 593, but we actually have on the books. It is a federal crime for armed federal agents to be at polling places. It is a federal crime for troops and federal agents to interfere with elections. Now, I think we have to be sober and honest with ourselves that this Department of Justice is probably not, I don't want to suggest that I think they're going to go prosecute the people who Trump has just ordered to go to the polls, if that's the world that we're living in. But it is important nonetheless to acknowledge, first of all, that this would be blatantly illegal. And even apart from those federal crimes, there are other legal protections in both federal and state law against interference by anyone, intimidation by anyone, including government agents in elections. And I do think, I don't depend on the courts to save us from a whole lot of different things these days. And the courts have not necessarily been doing what I would like to see them do on voting rights in elections recently. But I actually do think these laws are so clear and so strong that hopefully, if this comes to pass, people will go to court and there will be, orders issued against it. But as Jasleen said, that may be cold comfort to people who are seeing, armed federal agents in their neighborhoods even today. And so I want to take seriously the fact that people may be scared and they may be worried and they may be intimidated. And so what's really important is, first of all, to know the law, as Jasleen said, and to know that there will be people fighting to enforce those laws. But secondly, to know that thankfully in California and many other places, policymakers have been working for years to make sure people have lots of different options for casting their ballots. And so in 2025 and 2026, maybe more than ever before, it's really important for people to make a plan for how to vote. Do it the way that you're most comfortable with, taking everything into account. But whatever you do, don't let the threat of something that might be coming, or the sort of the statements that the president makes about our cities and how he's going to send people in to clean things up or whatever it might be, to scare you away from voting. It's so important that people respond to this kind of thing by investing in democracy. That's the only way we're going to save it. So I hope people take, stock of what's happening and take things seriously, but know that that they need to participate and that they can't let this kind of noise get in the way of that.
And often it is noise. I mean, we always there's always a lot of people who say this year True the Vote was one of the groups searching for fraud endlessly, not finding it. We're going to have 1 million people at the polls, and then a handful of people show up. Yeah. A lot of times this stuff is basically noise, and in fact doesn't actually materialize. And it's always a challenge for those of us who work on voting rights. How do we blow the whistle on what we see as a risk without, in doing that, scare people away? Right. And how do we avoid disenfranchising people by warning that they're being disenfranchised? How do we think about that as we do that?
So I think one of the things I think Sean mentioned much of this, but advocates are readying themselves in the event that this happens. Advocates are readying themselves to go to court. I also think election officials and state officials, state AG's office, should be sort of thinking about this and be prepared if this happens in their state. It should not be happening. Elections should not be dictated, written, or there should not be federal involvement in the way that states run their elections, simple and clearly. And so state officials should be preparing for that. And I think, and I really want to drive home the point of voters should know their options and really take advantage of the various options and be comfortable with how they vote. We are nothing without voters. We are no democracy without the people.
Yeah, and to be clear what we mean by options, vote by mail, order a mail ballot and deliver it in person, vote early, vote on election day.
Vote only
once, of course. Yes. And election officials.
You are from Chicago. I do need to point that out.
We'll make sure that election officials will make sure that happens. But you have a lot of options available to you, and more than in years past in most states in the country, and certainly in California, where every single voter is getting a ballot mailed to them in advance of the election. So hopefully people take advantage of those options. But the important point here is make a plan. Think about voting before Election Day and think about what you're going to do.
And Jasleen, you sort of pointed us to one of the questions we had about what can states do and what can local governments do. What should they be thinking about to stand up to this or to be ready in this just intense environment?
I think acknowledging the risk of this happening on Election Day, acknowledging it, not thinking, okay, it'll never happen, just be prepared. I think local officials, local election officials, likewise should acknowledge it, potentially talk to local law enforcement, to make a plan to handle anything that comes up on Election Day.
As you know, this is something we've been helping with conservative groups and voting rights groups. There's something called the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections, which is half law enforcement and half election officials. And so the police officers in all 50 states, beat cops, last election had pocket guides. How can I protect polling places and elections, and how not to overdo it? And in the past, I would say our great goal as voting rights advocates was not let's get as much law enforcement there as we could, but sometimes you need to, and it actually helped keep things on a very
well. The most important part is
keel.
having communication between. Like, hopefully you don't need to, but you need to have a whole bunch of law enforcement at the polls. And generally speaking, there won't be a bunch of law enforcement at the polls, and people should know that. But having communication between the people who run our elections and people who enforce our laws is really important so that they make the right decisions about when to take action, when to respond. But I do just want to say, like, I do think people should be, it is a different threat environment than it was in elections in the past. But the vast majority of Americans are going to go to vote in 2025 and 2026, and it's going to feel exactly the same way as.
And that's what happened last time,
Absolutely.
Right? And that was, but it didn't just happen. The system was hard, and people made it happen.
Absolutely.
But in fact, it was a very calm election in 2024, and so many of the worst worries didn't manifest themselves, and that's good. That's not that's something to be celebrated. There's a question from Clarissa Davis and Carla Pena, and you can both answer at once. Can the president cancel the 2026 election?
No.
Correct answer. That is not the case. Presidents. This is again one of the geniuses of our Constitution, and it's also this decentralized election system that we have. The other part of the question is, could a president issue a national emergency to make things harder? And of course, he's been declaring emergencies about every 10 minutes, and that would be the kind of thing.
Everything's an emergency.
Everything's an emergency. We are in court with others saying that, in fact, for example, the trade deficit is not an emergency, and so presidents cannot unilaterally set tariffs any more than presidents can unilaterally set income tax rates, and that case is being heard before the Supreme Court. He may try to declare an emergency, but that should not change the answer that the elections are going to proceed, as they were.
Absolutely. The president has certain emergency powers, but they are particular emergency powers. So there's, first of all, the debate over what's an emergency and what's not an emergency. And as you said, the president's declaring emergencies all over the place, declaring an emergency about a trade deficit that's existed for how long. All of a sudden it's an emergency. I don't know. But there's the second question of, if you declare an emergency, what do you get to do once there's an emergency? And the president has a defined set of emergency powers, and they do not include canceling elections. They don't include anything having to do with elections, frankly. So it would be completely illegal and out of line. And again, I know people hear the president doing all kinds of things that are blatantly illegal these days, and that's unfortunate that we live in that world now. And sometimes he seems to get away with them. But I actually think this is one place.
You're going to lose your late night talk show if you're not careful.
This is one place, as I talked about earlier, where I do think the courts will hold the line. And we have seen courts standing up to the president and his declaration of emergency powers on things like tariffs already. But this one is so far out of bounds for him to say it's an emergency, I can cancel elections. And it's such an affront to the way we think that our government is supposed to function, right? That's the kind of thing you hear about in other countries and go, well, that's obviously not supposed to happen. I think we all know, and I think the courts will actually hold the line on something like that.
We've seen lower courts issue rulings, and in 2020, the courts were very strong all across the board on the effort to overthrow the election. And generally speaking, federal courts and state courts are pretty good at policing voting in the elections. When it comes close to the elections, they pull back as it gets closer. They say we're not willing to make big rulings because it's too close to the election, which sometimes we like and sometimes is very frustrating. But basically, the courts have really done a pretty good job, we think, on this. But the worry always is the Supreme Court is much more political, much seemingly more ideological, and lately has been much more compliant with expansions of presidential power. Do you think we can count on the Supreme Court in this coming year on elections? Because there's some pretty unnerving cases coming up this year.
Right. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. I feel like with the Supreme Court right now, I have faith in some of the lower court rulings that are coming out, but if much of these cases, any of these cases go up to the Supreme Court, I really don't know what's going to happen.
I think it depends on what you're – I agree. I also don't know what to expect. I think some of us have been surprised on certain voting rights cases going one way or another in recent years, and it's been a little bit hard to predict in some instances. I would say I don't have faith in the Supreme Court to protect voting rights in the way that it has in the past. The Supreme Court has been now for a couple of decades retreating from its role as a protector of voting rights and has in fact affirmatively done harm to many of the laws that we have in place to protect voting rights.
And they took a case on the Voting Rights Act that they actually asked for a second argument.
Yes,
on
right
a case
now
where it really looks like they may want to knock the other leg out of the chair.
Yeah, they may be
Rights
poised
Act.
to do even more harm to those voting rights protections. The case you're talking about, Louisiana v. Calais, there are cases up there right now, like the Turtle Mountain case may go up to in front of the Supreme Court, but there are a number of cases that raise the question of whether private individuals, voters themselves, can go to court under the Voting Rights Act, which of course has been accepted truth for 60 plus years.
93% of the cases brought under the Voting Rights Act are brought by voters.
So I don't think we can count on the Supreme Court to do its job in protecting voting rights across the board. I do think what you were talking about is a sort of different question when you were talking about holding strong in 2020, that there are lines that all of our courts, including the Supreme Court, seem unwilling to cross when it comes to our elections. And we had a recent reminder of this just earlier this year. There was a battle that lasted about 6 months over a Supreme Court seat in North Carolina, an election in North Carolina, where the losing candidate, who lost by only a few hundred votes, challenged the outcome of that election and tried to get the election overturned by making arguments basically that the rules of the election should be changed after the election was over. And the state courts in North Carolina seemed somewhat willing to go there. But a federal district court, presided over by a very conservative judge, said no, and said literally in those words, you can't change the rules to the game after it's been played. So while I don't expect the court to do what I would like it to do when it comes to stopping racial discrimination in voting, for instance, or protecting voting rights under the protections that have been in place for the last 6 decades, I do think we still can rely on the courts to not allow just outright election subversion, including the Supreme Court. I think 2020 shows us that they are not willing to go there. We all have to hold them accountable to that. Everyone should expect this Supreme Court not to say it's okay to change the rules to an election after the fact, not to overturn an election. And it is a very low bar that we're holding them to there, right? Like the person who gets the most votes wins. You don't get to change the rules after the fact is a low bar. I acknowledge that. But I do actually think we can expect them, and we should all be looking to them to hold that line at least.
This is more than just the triumph of hope over experience. There's actually reason to think that the courts can step up and will be obviously very much in the middle of that. Now, a few people, Ann Gilson and Edward Brow and many others, have asked about gerrymandering, which actually came out as an issue sort of after your report was done. But I think when most people think of, well, an effort to kind of affect the rules for this election, what's going on with redistricting is a big part of it. And the question is, what's happening? Will courts stop it? And what kind of impact will this have? So I think it's, redistricting happens every 10 years because the census it's supposed to happen every 10 years. What's extraordinary in Texas, right, is that it's in the middle of the decade. It's explicitly to draw 5 seats for one political party. It's at the cost of voters of color and their representation, and it's at the behest of somebody who doesn't live in Texas, President Trump, who basically demanded that this happen. And it set off this extraordinary redistricting arms race all over the country. Are we following the California redistricting ballot initiative? That would add that would potentially add seats for the Democrats if it were to pass. And you see things like this going on all over the country. We think, it's not a surprise to me that the Democrats are responding as they are.
It's an arms race, like you said. Once you open this up to that kind of political hardball, you expect politicians to play hardball.
Politicians will be politicians.
Absolutely.
But that can't be the ultimate answer.
No. I think we are in this place because of the Supreme Court and because of Congress. The Supreme Court opened this door by saying they weren't going to police partisan gerrymandering and have opened it even wider in recent years by suggesting that partisan gerrymandering is actually like a defense to engaging in race discrimination in drawing maps, which is absurd.
So people say, we or others might say, you're being racially discriminatory in this map. We're just partisan hacks. We're just doing what we're supposed to do.
We're not trying to stop people of color from voting. We're just trying to stop black people. Just trying to stop Democrats from voting. And my own Freudian slip is maybe telling from what I think is actually happening in some of these instances. But yes, it's not a surprise that once one party starts engaging in political hardball, the other party will. As I said, the Supreme Court opened that door. Congress failed to close that door. Congress can put rules in place to stop partisan gerrymandering, and we've been asking them to do that for a long time. They came close a couple of years ago with the Freedom to Vote Act, and they didn't quite get it done because of the filibuster. Congress should fix this problem.
Right. We should have national standards that would apply to red states and blue states alike. Absolutely. And again, it came achingly close. People don't realize how close it was. It passed the House of Representatives. It had a majority in the Senate. 2 senators who supported the bill wouldn't change the filibuster rules so the Freedom to Vote Act and John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act could become law. I think that there is much more of a consensus now, and those 2 senators, Senators Sinema and Manchin, actually are no longer in the Senate, that this is so important that this is actually something where a majority ought to be able to vote.
Well, I think everybody's seeing what's happening in Texas and now California and elsewhere are probably starting to feel even more how important this is.
Well, and the point is this would literally have stopped this arms race before it started. It would have been illegal for Texas to do or California, for that matter, to do what it's doing.
Worth taking a second for people to think about what it is that Texas is actually doing here. This is a state saying explicitly that the policy of the state is to elect Republicans into office. That's the policy of the state of Texas, is we want more Republicans to be in our congressional delegation. Nobody in this country should be okay with the state, the government, saying it is the policy to have one party win over the other party. And what's happening in California is a little different because it's actually the voters of California voting for this. And so there's, a little bit more of a democratic element to that, small d democratic. But I think should offend all Americans of any party to think that it is okay for a state to say explicitly, we as the government are favoring this party over that party, and we're going to make sure they can win more elections. That's what Texas is doing, and that's what the Supreme Court said they could do. And that is just, as I said, I think it should offend everybody, and I don't know that people are necessarily thinking about it that way. And it sends a really terrible message to voters because it tells voters that the rules are rigged against them before they even go cast a ballot. And they have their own government telling them that, and I think it's really – really troubling.
And of course, gerrymandering is done by both parties
Absolutely.
When they can.
Yeah.
And I think people understand that. And it actually has been in different states. People, we worked in Ohio, for example, with the former Republican Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court, who had ruled against a partisan gerrymander, I think 5 times, and 5 times the legislature just said, never mind, we're not going to listen to you. Yeah. It is emphatically, the fight for fair maps is one of the most genuinely nonpartisan or bipartisan.
Yeah, just like I think anyone who hears what Texas is doing and thinks I'm okay with that should ask if they'd be okay with Illinois saying it's the policy of the state of Illinois to elect more Democrats. It's not what state governments are supposed to be doing. It's what political parties are supposed to do. It's what voters are supposed to choose who wins. But the people who hold our offices and run our governments, the people who are running our legislatures, aren't supposed to pick the outcome of our elections and who is going to win. And, people say it all the time, but voters are supposed to pick their politicians, not the other way around.
Hear, hear. So, Jasleen, I'm going to ask you the final question, and feel free to wax lyrical. Why should voters care? What should voters do? And what do you want people to take away from this conversation?
So I think what people should take away from this conversation is sort of a call to not be desensitized to what's going on. There's a lot of absurdity going on. There are actions that this federal government has taken that are absolutely egregious and at times unlawful, unconstitutional. And so this is a time where I would really encourage voters, despite what's going on, to show up and show out, and for the folks who have elections in their state this year, vote. Like, actually vote. Like, this is the one time we have to say something about what's going on with our federal government, and to vote and show out despite what the federal government is trying to do to people's ability to go out and vote. And again, a lot of this is really absurd. And so don't let that stop you.
It matters. It's a lot harder to undermine a democracy when people are watching and when people are shouting and when people especially are voting. People might think it doesn't matter, my vote doesn't matter. There's so many close races. We know these votes do matter, but it matters even more just that the imprimatur of the people gives the government its legitimacy. And these are first principles. These are things that we never, I don't know about you, I never thought I would have to work on this stuff or fight for it or think about it. But it turns out it's really very significant and at risk in ways that we all have to care about every day. I'm really appreciative to my 2 Brennan Center colleagues, to Sean Morales-Doyle and to Jasleen Singh. I'm privileged to get to work with you in this fight, and we know that we are trying to make the American idea real. Right around the corner here, as you know, we have the Declaration of Independence on our wall. We believe that ideal of government that rests on the consent of the governed is something worth fighting for. And so thanks for doing what you do, and thank you to everybody for watching.